coming at us from all sides. And so I've always thought that, how do we get around this? I probably think about this a good deal of the time, and I think that our greatest resource is the passion behind the people in this room, and the ingenuity and the resourcefulness. I mean, the fact that this is even happening at all, this shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't all be in this room. And so we need to find a way to create these safe spaces for all of us working together, because this is really hard, emotionally taxing work, and it's sometimes dangerous. And the only way that we're going to be able to join together and find this unity that we keep talking about, why are you being so divisive? We need to unite. Is until we can start, until we can start. Sorry, my notes aren't close. Recognizing that difference isn't a liability, but it's in fact our greatest asset. We can't move forward. I think that personhood is a really good example of how, I know that some people saw Atlee speak, who organized against Personhood Mississippi, about how you end up with a lot of unusual allies at times. And when we can recognize how our differences can reach out to different people, reach out to different communities, I think that's the only way that we'll be able to move forward. So I want to end with, I know it's kind of trite, but I'm going to end with an Audre Lorde quote. Who doesn't love Audre Lorde, really? Difference must be not merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. And so I want everyone to keep that in mind as they listen to the more specific types of privilege and allyship from most of our panelists. Thank you.
So, what I'm talking about today is that reproductive justice is a queer issue. And queer issues also tie in with issues of reproductive justice. Although that fact seems to have escaped most homonormative organizing. When I say homonormative organizing, I mean organizing around things like gay rights. Because gay rights creates a single axis of identity. It makes that person's sexuality a single axis of identity, and that rights, we go to the state and we ask the state to grant us rights on that particular axis. But reproductive justice organizing is primarily ignored within gay rights organizing because of that. Because gay rights organizing, by making that single axis of identity, doesn't take into account the idea that people have these intersubjectivities that they need to have taken into account. When you make the source of your struggle the issue of representation and rights, by necessity you have to ignore other issues, because this thing comes in, oh, you're being divisive, or oh, you're watering down our message. And by doing that, by having people come into your organization and say, okay, we're going to work for marriage equality, which is a good fight, right? If we start talking about how that ties advertising of reproductive justice, people often accuse other people, saying, oh, that's diluting our message. You know, we have to work on like one issue at a time, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem with that is that not only are you like going to the state and asking for something that should be granted freely in the first place, but you're then also like on a single issue point, and you're ignoring these other issues that come into you know, the identity upon which you're predicating your politics. And, you know, we need to really start being honest, particularly within the gay rights movement, that the gay rights movement is a male-centric, cis-centric, and white-centric form of organizing, right? It's one of the primary reasons why I self-identify as queer, because I think queer creates a way that we can start thinking about bringing in a multiplicity of people and a multiplicity of issues around gender and sexuality and reproductive justice. I mean, these issues, they combine, like the issues in the gay rights movement combine to remove any discourse around the body, right? And the gay rights discourse becomes a discourse of we're just like everyone else. But the fact of the matter is that queer people have special queer body needs. Right? Queer people have queer body needs, and that needs to be recognized. That also needs to be recognized within the reproductive justice movement, which is why the reproductive justice movement is much better than like the reproductive rights movement, right? As a term, because it allows more inclusion and more inclusivity for those particular issues. So, how is reproductive justice queer, and how can we queer reproductive justice? Well, believe it or not, there are many people who are queer that also have reproductive issues, like all of them, right? So, I mean, those two things go together. And these issues involve access to healthcare. They involve access to healthcare for men, access to healthcare for women, access to healthcare for the intersex, access to healthcare for transgender issues, access to health information, access to information about sexuality and safe sexuality, access to information about contraception, and the reproductive rights movement, as it shifts to the reproductive justice movement, needs to account for non-normative bodies and the queer desires that come out of those bodies. And so, also, the homonormative rights movement needs to check its privilege and start to think about the interconnections between race, class, gender, and the oppression of women, and how those two groups can start to create discourses, particularly, I think, grassroots discourses about creating spaces on the grassroots level where those oppressions can be alleviated for the particularities of queer bodies. And the structured system of oppression, right, that limits people's subjectivity, both for women and for queer people and for all people, right, is one and the same. Like, we need to confront that structural inequality. Queer politics, right, has to, by its very nature, recognize the intersectionality of this oppression. And I believe that the reproductive justice movement does a very good job of recognizing the intersectionality of this oppression. And that's why these two are made for each other, right? We need to move beyond the dichotomy of, you know, which privilege is greater or which oppression is greater, and start finding commonalities that allow us to work together without erasing the privileges that are inherent to our person and without making light of the oppressions that we create when we're around other people and visit with them with that privilege. So how do we organize together? Well, the first step is really recognizing that there's a common bond. That is the primary structure of power that organizes against reproductive justice and homosexuality is heteronormativity, right? It's that heteropatriarchy that creates a systemic form of oppression. And we need to start having, I think, a more frank discussion about, and we try very hard, I mean, even in your speech, about, oh, maybe we shouldn't use the term enemy. We tried very hard to, like, pretend that there are not people out there that do not want to destroy our bodies. But our bodies are hated by these people, right? And these people who hate our bodies are in control of power. And they will do what they can to create systemic oppression, either based on any of our intersubjectivities, on race, on class, on male or female, on sexuality, right? And they have done, over time, a particularly good job at creating an oppressive system. So the reproductive and queer movements need to recognize that queer people are intersubjective, right? That they have reproductive parts that have more than one axis of identity continuum. So this common antagonist needs to be confronted. And the fact of the matter is that this antagonist, right, these antagonists hate genitalia, they hate desire, right? They hate women's desire, and they hate queer desire, and they hate our naughty bits and wish to morally legislate it, right? And by extension of having naughty bits as a human, they wish to suppress you, right? They hate your naughty bits, and because you have and enact on those naughty bits in some sort of desire, they set up a system of oppression, either in abortion or in sex or in healthcare or in safe-sex practices or access to contraception, right? And access to hormonal treatments and healthcare for non-normative bodies. And so this can be a good point to really start a dialogue about the way that hatred for our bodies brings us together. How can we start to organize and form coalitions, right, to build a new structure, I think, primarily through grassroots organizing, ways to restructure our communities, right, not erasing privilege, not erasing difference, right, working to erase privilege, and try to begin to work together and bring these two particular movements into coalitional work together. Because until we start working together, we're going to just keep being divided, right? And one bill will come out, right, removing gays from the National Guard, and then another bill will come out, like removing, or granting personhood to things. So, all right? All right, well, that's all I really have to say. Thank you for your time.
Everybody. Can you hear me now? Oh, I like both. I like this anyhow because I like the color. My name's Lisa Frey, and I'm a professor here at OU. I'm also a psychologist, and I was in practice for many years before I came to OU as an academic. I think because of that, I have a little bit different perspective. I've always been really committed to community engagement and action. Which has made me popular and very unpopular here at OU. Okay. So today I want to focus on the university campus as a part of the reproductive justice intersectional framework. Certainly I think we can all agree that there's no doubt that university campuses are places of privilege on certain levels. And we know that access to post-secondary education, being accepted into academia and so forth, is influenced by interlocking oppressions for those on the margins. But universities are also social institutions that have many concealed structures that help to maintain unequal power statuses and contribute to reproductive oppression, or of course can be part of the change process as everyone here today is trying to be a part of. Obviously, there's many aspects of this that are relevant, but because we're time limited, I'm only going to focus briefly on two of them. First of all, my experience has been that university administrations increasingly seem to have their own agendas that don't necessarily prioritize students' best interests or, frankly, the best interests of faculty and staff. See, that's why they love me. The voices of young students overall are marginalized, as too inexperienced, too young to be taken seriously. And of course, they're further consigned to the margins if their social or group identities place them outside of the center. Some of you probably heard Jordan Ward speak in the sexual assault an intimate partner violence workshop earlier, and I think that's a good example, the student movement around changing the way sexual assault is handled on the OU campus. I think that's a great example of what I'm talking about, because while the outcome has certainly been worthy of celebration, my own observation is that the process of that change has been fraught with many roadblocks and has probably even been traumatizing for some of the people that have been involved in that movement. Also, the voices of dissident faculty and staff voicing concerns regarding very real problems of oppression and discrimination and inequity are often silenced by administrations that inaccurately reframe these issues. And I want to talk about a couple of my observations in regard to how I think those things are reframed. First of all, I believe that discrimination is often reframed as faculty or staff conflict or a student conflict. When issues of very real experiences of discrimination are brought to the attention of university officials, one of the responses often is, well, these folks just can't get along. This isn't really about discrimination. This is about people just not being able to work out their problems. The second example I want to talk about has to do with tenure. And believe me, I've benefited from tenure. I'm tenured. And I don't think tenure is a problem, but what I do think is a problem is that it's often used as an excuse to not intervene. Certainly there are many ways to intervene in problems on campuses aside from abrogating people's tenure. And to say, well, this person has tenure, there's nothing we can do, is simply a way of avoiding any responsibility. And then the last example in this regard has to do with something I've been seeing increasingly used by some university administrations, which is the use of the right to freedom of speech as a reason to not engage in exploring options or to not take action. Now, does anybody in here not agree with freedom of speech? I agree with freedom of speech, but freedom of speech is very different and can be used in a way to simply avoid very real problems that need to be dealt with. And I want to give you an example of this. I have a friend who's a faculty member on campus, and her partner is also a faculty member, and they lost a child in a very traumatic way. When the Justice for All anti-choice organization was on campus, my friend and her partner had to walk through a very traumatizing display in order to get to their offices. They very appropriately approached university officials with possible solutions, one of which was relocating the Justice for All group to an area where students and faculty and staff would still have full access if they wished, but would not be in such a central location that people were required to walk through that display. But the university continued to maintain a narrow conceptualization of the issue as only about freedom of speech, and not about the real issue, which was marginalizing my friend's lived experience and their freedom to work in an environment that was not hostile and oppressive to them. On all levels, these problems can be maintained by our student, faculty, and staff colleagues who are not only invested in maintaining the same conditions, but are often rewarded for being bystanders, and who sometimes punish those who do use their voices in the service of justice. And they they punish them by isolating them, by giving them decreased access to opportunities such as university awards, endowed fellowships, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of my greatest concerns is the way that we as faculty sometimes abandon students as they struggle to challenge campus experiences of inequity. This, I think, occurs because we mute and hide our own voices to decrease what really is very real personal risk to faculty and staff members who align with students. And then, now remember I'm a psychologist, and then in order to cope with the fact that we abandoned students, we reframed their struggle as life lessons. They just needed to experience this to find out what life is really like. This has been a very real struggle for me because I came into academia from the private sector and I taught social justice in the classroom. I very quickly looked around and saw the cost to enacting what I was teaching in my actual campus professional life. And for me, a critical moment was when I was approached by some students who had experienced an incident of very clear discrimination in the classroom and had handled it very well. They spoke to the person involved to no avail, and they directly asked me if I would help them. So for me, that was the point at which I had to make a decision. Now, the second aspect I want to talk about is really brief. And it involves something that's very deceptively simple, which is listening. Those of us that are privileged with access to higher education can become very overly invested in our academic currency of scholarship. We forget that there's a whole world out there where people are dealing with very pragmatic issues of survival. And they don't care so much about whether we agree with this theory or that theory. They don't care so much whether we think this terminology is more important than this terminology. Now, my central point is not that language is unimportant, because we know that's not true. But my point is that it's the quality of our listening that's perhaps more important than our terminology and our theories. Because the quality of our listening is what will allow us to truly contribute in any kind of meaningful way to a social justice movement, including the reproductive justice movement. Thank you.
So my name is Tahaie, and I'm the Director of Racial Justice at the YWCA in Tulsa. I'm also Roxanne's cousin. You might have met me earlier as I was awkwardly walking up the stairs, doing the proud family photo. You know how we do. The bio that I have in your program looks like it cut off in the middle or something like that, so that's why I was giving you my credentials. I also wanted to say that I'm on Twitter, although I'm on a sabbatical, but it's just my first and last name. I'm also on Facebook, although I'm a little selective there, and I'm on Gmail, which is my first and last name at gmail.com. So if for any reason you all want to get in touch, that's how you can find me. Here comes Roxanne to take her family photo of me. This is awesome. Her mom told me. So for my day job, I do racial justice work, which is a fancy way of saying that I work around issues of race and racism, identity and privilege, et cetera, et cetera. The kind of advocacy work that I'm involved in lately has been a lot of work around immigration issues, which, as you all have already heard today, is near and dear to my heart. And also a few other issues. But although I work in a women's organization, this is probably my first official foray into the women's studies sect. So I'm glad to be here. I'm very inspired today. And I just want to tell you a little bit about myself in the spirit of what, I don't know where Lynn is, but what she's taught us all to do. And I confess I arrived this morning with no notes, because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to touch on today. And throughout the day I started just to compile the things that I've learned in the short amount of time that I've had the benefit, privilege of doing the work that I get to do. Mainly just to let you all know the lessons that I've learned, and I should say that I'm probably very unqualified to be on this panel among people who have been as eloquent as they are today. So I admit up front that I'm so in the process. I'm so on this journey. I'm so learning about all of these things, and so I hope that if I misstep, you all will forgive me, but understand the spirit in which my journey is being expressed to all of you today. I'll start by saying that, much like everyone else, I do believe in owning identity up front, especially the ways in which, when we're talking about privilege and the ways that we've been victims of others' privilege, to also own our own. So I am a U.S. born, first out of the big family that Roxanne talked about, born in the U.S. I think that makes me an official anchor baby. I'm a straight, cis, middle class, college educated, English speaking, English is my second language, able-bodied, ambiguously ethnic looking, Iranian American, light-skinned woman of color. That's it, I'm done. So if you think of power as sort of a sphere in which the center is privileged and the margins are occupied by the oppressed, like everyone here, I traverse, dare I say, transgress that demarcating line multiple times with this identity. I'd like to believe, as an advocate, a radical, that I live only in the borderlands, but the truth is I'm solidly part of that core part much of the time. So again, listening to Lynn and taking a note from her, I'm sharing the story of the lessons that I've learned, both as a woman of color who hasn't really felt invited into the reproductive rights or /justice movement, and as a straight cis woman as I've tried to unpack my own privilege around that. I should know that everything that I have learned on this journey, I've learned from smarter and mostly more marginalized women than myself. Poor women, other women of color, transgender women, etc. One of the things one of my mentors taught me once when I was working at another social justice organization doing a different type of social justice work, when I was struggling with why I was experiencing the things I was in that organization, she told me that when oppressed communities recreate their own communities, they recreate oppression. And so I think that although I really appreciated what you had to say about how they all hate all of our naughty bits, I would suggest that while they hate our bodies, we can mirror that hatred in our own movements. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit about what privilege allows, how it does allow those things, and what we can do instead. I think the first thing that privilege allows allows us to refuse to engage our own power. It allows us to frame ourselves as oppressed. It gives us a pass to examining the ways in which we oppress. So I would give as an example that with the small exception of the video at the top of this event, which was really moving, I haven't heard much engagement of trans identity during this day. And it's been largely erased from the stage, and while I assume that that was not deliberate, that doesn't make it unreal. I think that privilege also allows siloing within our movements, the sense that I'm doing the X thing right now, so I can't do your thing. It allows us to maintain the delusion that we, whoever we might be, don't need them, those people who are less privileged than we. In spite of the fact that the forces that are against us are fewer, but better are organized and more integrated. And so we actually need they and you and us far more than we admit, but our privilege sometimes inhibits us from being able to see that. The ways in which this plays out, at least in the forms that I've observed or experienced or probably reinforced, are, for example, framing reproductive justice as exclusively a women's issue or an issue around choice, which marginalizes women of color and trans people as well. We've already talked a little bit today about how for communities of color, the language around individualism and privacy and choice doesn't necessarily resonate. That when you come from a communal culture that's grounded in family and community, that sort of thing simply sounds like it's for somebody else and not for me. I think it also relates to when we talk about reproductive organs, that when we talk about trans women, their reproductive organs allow cis women to erase their needs. Or trans men whose masculinity is erased when they're misgendered as really women in rag femme circles and whose reproductive issues are simultaneously ignored. It prevents us from seeing that choice is just as much about enabling healthy, successful parenthood as it is about having the choice to end pregnancy. In fact, the language of choice itself involves the sense that some people have a choice at all. I think that the language around criminalizing bodies is really important, and one of the things I wish that we'd talked a little bit bit more about is that when we're talking about criminalizing bodies, it also involves the hypersexualization of bodies of people of color, and the ways that state-sponsored violence polices those bodies through things like forced sterilization and the imagery that we saw in Lynn's slideshow earlier. And when we're talking about things like long-acting reversible birth control, we have to be mindful of the history that invokes among communities of color that have been forced sterilized. I think centering exclusively abortion within the reproductive rights movement misses the lived reality of poor women, of women of color, of trans women, people who are dealing with survival sex, people whose sex offenses are disproportionately punished in spite of the fact that it's merely to get by. 2 minutes, great. Even framing reproductive justice as a healthcare issue forgets the fact that barriers to access to healthcare goes beyond economic barriers. For the undocumented, it's not just about money, but about being able to qualify and also being fearful of the deputization of people who are quote-unquote caregivers. Framing reproductive justice as healthcare also erases the fact that many trans people, especially transgender women of color, experience violence, very, very real violence from healthcare providers. As much as from state actors like police and others. I think language around organs and things like uterus and vagina is cis supremacist triggering language, and we need to be more conscious of that. And as I said before, it allows our movement to recreate oppression. We're dismissive of the criticism that Planned Parenthood has racism in its history, and yet it does, and in denying so marginalizes women of color who desperately need those services, and whose images we use when we talk about denying Planned Parenthood funding in order to justify the need for it, and yet we marginalize them nonetheless. I think it's important to remember that Big Gay, or Gay Inc., has issues with transphobia and consistently throws trans people under the bus, and using them, again, colonizing their bodies is unhelpful when we're talking about creating a unified social justice movement. I think that the reason that I feel marginalized from feminism was really, really clear during the image of Slutwalk that has gone around, that many of you have probably seen, with the young woman holding up a sign calling women the N-word of the world. Not acknowledging and not working through these realities creates barriers to engagement and participation among people who are also marginalized on the other side. We can't take for granted that just because the other side is marginalizing them, that they're going to come running to us. So what to do instead? Engage and acknowledge your own privilege. Time is up, I have to go through the to-do list. I don't want to leave you on that note. Engage and acknowledge your own privilege. Go to the website Derailing for Dummies and read it every single day until you've been decided by heart. Don't just use it to send to Twitter followers who show their ass, but actually read it and do it yourself. Google all of the unpacking privilege checklists and read those every day. Listen to the voices of women of color, particularly transgender women of color, poor women, women with disabilities. Subscribe to these on your Google Reader. Follow them on Facebook so that you have a constant awareness of what is going on in the lives of these people every single day. Show up to the spaces, only the ones that you're invited to, and just listen. Decenter your experience. This is the hardest thing to do because we don't know that we're doing it, but it's important to do it anyway. Take up issues that are on the fringes of the reproductive justice movement. How many of you know that affirmative action is up for a vote in November in Oklahoma? Economic justice for poor people, for indigenous people, environmental justice, immigration issues, healthcare access, WIC and SNAP funding. How many of you know that the income tax is trying to be eliminated this legislative session? Read, keep reading, don't stop reading. Have these conversations, engage in the difficult things, don't look away when it gets hard, let yourself off the hook when you make a mistake, and get back in the fight the next day.